Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about the election, the midterm election 2022, from the perspective of county clerks. And we'll begin with Eve first. Thank you, Eve, for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you. So just by way of background, I am the Summit County Clerk, and I took over this position back in May 2021 when our county clerks, Kent Jones, retired, and the Democratic Party elected me to fill the slot. And then this most recent election, I was on the ballot and ran for office and was elected to a 4-year term for the first time. So I'm excited about that. And I'm happy to share with all of you a little bit about what was going on our end of elections. We were tracking and wondering, and I think clerks across the country were wondering what effect all of the election denying would have on elections themselves. For us personally, voter turnout, just a host of different things. And it's, very hard to tease out what came from what cause, but I will say we had about 4.5% in-person voter turnout this time, which is more than double what we've had in the last few elections. So that was interesting. I assume some of that is from people concerned with mail-in voting, and then also the flip side of not being concerned with COVID and being willing to go into a public place and that sort of thing. We definitely had a few people tell us that, they hadn't voted in person in a few years. And so they just wanted to do that again because they hadn't done it in a while. So that was sort of interesting. We prepared, we'd seen some early predictions that it might be around a 20% turnout, in-person turnout. So we prepared for that. That didn't happen. It was lower than that. But we definitely stayed busy at all of our locations throughout the day. We did have 4 in-person voting locations on election day, and we did 4 days of early voting from 8 to 5. On the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Monday before the election, and had people show up at all of that. And we did the early voting. We only did in 2 locations, one at Kimball Junction, and then at the Richlands Building, and then the other in Colville at the clerk's office. So, so the vast majority was through mail-in ballots, and as noted, we did have a 71.9% turnout for our county, which I think the average turnout in Utah was 64.2%, so we were above average. The lowest county was Tooele at about 59%. The highest county was Wayne County at 84%. Made me curious as to what local races they had going on, but I haven't had a chance to look in to see what turned that out. But that one of the other things that was, I think, very notable in this election was we had a couple of the counties had problems with their ballots not being treated as election mail. And that was in Iron County and Carbon County. But they both, by the time everything was finished and counted, they both came in. Iron County came in at about a 60.1% turnout and Carbon at 61.3% turnout. Though both those counties really did a lot of voter outreach when they realized that ballots had gotten misdirected and went different places and didn't get the priority that they were supposed to get. There were problems with their printers and how that all happened, and so they have said that they will not be using those printers again. And so that's what went on in those counties. We did not have any particular threats or reports of threats to voters or to election officials in any way in our county. And so I'm happy to report that. We did have poll watchers at polling locations and at the counting location. And we tried to make sure to answer all questions that we could. We had a couple of concerns about, whether there were suspicious people at ballot boxes. We reported those to the sheriff's office, and the sheriff investigated it and found no cause for concern from their perspective. That's sort of a quick synopsis. I'd be happy to get into more detail. I'm sure you are all aware there was it took our county, I guess I should cover this. It took our county longer on election night than any of the other counties to report our results. And that was for a couple of different reasons. But I think the main factors were that we had 3 different races with write-in candidates, and we had 2 races with withdrawn candidates. And when you have either of those things, it requires close attention to the ballots with respect to the write-in candidates to make sure that you're catching all of the potential write-ins. And then with respect to the withdrawn candidates, you have to there's particular steps you have to take to make sure you're not reporting the results for the withdrawn candidates. And I think Amy Price, who's the chief deputy here, mentioned at the canvass that, there were approximately 2,000 ballots that had to be, hand reviewed on election night to make sure that the write-ins, whether they actually had a write-in or not, or whether it was just an extraneous mark. So that was the cause of that delay. We've talked with the Lieutenant Governor's office and with the company that we work with for the machines that do the vote counting and scanning about whether there were ways that we could address these issues in the future. And there are some, and so we're talking about that. There's some of the issues would need to have a statewide resolution, and some of them we might be able to just resolve on our own in some pieces. So we'll see. I'm hoping for the statewide resolution first, but if we don't get that, we have some alternatives for next time. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. You had a write-in opponent, right?
Yes, I did.
Was that person, would you consider that person an election denier?
I guess what I would say is that is how she was categorized. The Tribune did an article and sort of that talked to all the different clerk candidates throughout the states, and they did identify her that way. She in her campaign website, she did identify that she had concerns with mail-in voting, with what had happened in the 2020 election. And I think her quote to the Tribune was that she just wasn't sure about the results of that election.
Okay. Other questions?
Chris?
Yeah, hi, Eve. You mentioned, I think, some 2,000 ballots that required hand review of some sort. Can you describe what triggers or what was the common cause for a hand review and a sense of how that gets remedied?
Sure. So when ballots are put through the machine that both scans and counts them, it's programmed to look at certain fields on the document. And when you have a race where every candidate is on the ballot by name, it's looking for those little bubbles that you fill in. When you have a write-in candidate, it has to be programmed to look at a broader area to determine whether you have anything is there. And it doesn't distinguish between say a name or a pencil mark, or say a fold that shows up as a shadow on the ballot. So that, and there's an issue, and you set the machine when you do have write-ins, there's a sensitive, you want to have the machine be sensitive to picking that up in case somebody is writing very lightly or has a light colored pen. You want it to pick it up to be very sensitive to all of that. And so what it does when it goes through the machine is if it senses something, but it can't tell what it is, or it senses that there might be a write-in there, it sends the ballot to a middle slot on the machine. So all of the votes it can read, it does, and then it identifies what it thinks the vote is in that particular race. And but it also says that it needs to be, and the phrase we use is that it needs to be adjudicated. And so then what happens is when those results are transferred from that machine to the desktop, and we look at, we can actually view the scan of the ballot, and then we can also view how the ballot is being counted by the machine. And so we look at that and we can see where the race is that the machine is saying there's a mark on it that it doesn't know how to read. And we view, two people sit down and view that, and they decide whether they can agree on what was happening on that ballot, whether there's a write-in, whether it's a stray mark or something else. And then to make sure, and then they can change that to change how the computer's reading it to reflect what the ballot actually says. And the standard we use is what the voters, you're looking for the voter intent. And so the other aspect of looking at write-ins is if you look at the names, and there are some write-ins that are in Utah are not valid write-ins, they're invalid write-ins. So you have to actually declare your intent to be a write-in candidate before the election. And as long as you do that, then races get attributed to you, or votes get attributed to you in that race. If you don't, they won't. And you always have people who will write in fictional people or fictional characters, like you'll have Mickey Mouse, or we had Darth Vader, or things like that. People were voting for. So those get counted as invalid. We look at that. We move those to invalid. People who, but like if, like my opponent, her name was Dawn Langston, and if her name was put forth in any fashion that would suggest it's that person, it doesn't have, the spelling doesn't have to be exact or anything like that. It just has to be close. So you're looking for anything that looks like, okay, is this a vote for this person, or is it an invalid vote, or just a stray mark?
I'm thinking that we have the most secure elections we could possibly have with you, Eve. Oh, gosh. So thank you. I think Martha, let's do one more question here. Martha.
Yeah, the turnout numbers are incredible, frankly. But I'm wondering, it's a percent of what? Is it a percent of registered voters? Because I've seen numbers for Utah that were more in the 46 range. So the math wouldn't work. And I don't remember the source, and it doesn't matter for this, but I just wanted to make sure I understood, you know, because you read these things and you say, wow, it's a mail-in state, only 46% doesn't look great. 71% is kind of what you'd like to see. So what was it a percentage of?
So it is, the percentage we work from is the active registered voters. And so if somebody hasn't voted in the last 3 elections, they're not considered an active voter. If we have sent a ballot to their home or to their mailing address, and it gets returned to us as undeliverable, in most cases, that person then would become inactive, and we would send them a confirmation notice to see if they had moved or not. And the difference there is a ballot, as you all may or may not know, a ballot cannot be forwarded by the mail. It's not it can't be to another address. but a confirmation card that we send out when we're trying to figure out where a voter went can be forwarded. So we send that out, hoping the person will get back to us as to whether they've moved within the county or out of the state or what's going on. And then we try and accommodate it that way. So those people are all inactive, but of the active voters, that's who we're talking about.
Got it. Good question, Martha. Katy Owens-Hubler, would you take it from here?
Yeah, and I'm just gonna share my screen if that's gonna work here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
Give me 1 second and I'll go into presentation mode. I just want to say too, with that eligible voters, so a lot of times on the news, you'll see a percentage of eligible voters. And in Utah, we have a lot of eligible voters that aren't registered. So that's why when it's a percentage of registered voters, we tend to have very high turnout numbers. Like in 2020, it was in the 90%. But when you look at percentage of eligible voters, it's not nearly as good. And that's why ELSA and Voterize was so great in getting more people registered. We really need efforts like that in Utah because there's a lot of people that could vote, but they're just not even registered. So great, sorry, I'll introduce myself. I am Katy Owens-Hubler. I do election administration consulting professionally. So I work all over the country. I got into this, which is kind of a strange sort of thing to get into, less so now, I guess, than it was 12 years ago when I first started. But in 2010, I started working for the Denver Elections Division and was recruiting poll workers at the time. We still had in-person polling locations in Denver. Thank goodness we very soon moved to all mail ballot voting because it was so hard to find poll workers in the 150 locations throughout Denver. So that's how I got my start, is trying to beg people to be poll workers. So I have an appreciation for poll workers and election officials and everybody all over the country. And I have to admit that I had a fair amount of anxiety going into this election because of all the rhetoric that was out there about 2020 not being fair, the challenging of results, the way that people were talking. I was afraid that we would actually maybe even see some violence in polling locations. So I want to start this by saying I am so glad how this election went. And just real quick, are you seeing just my slide? Or are you seeing the notes too? Just out of curiosity.
Not the notes.
Not the notes. Okay, good. I have two screens, so sometimes I don't know for sure. So overall, I was going into it, I was very anxious and it went just as well as it could have gone. In fact, it was a boring election. Like, it reminded me of elections in years past where, there were little things like printer errors or electronic poll books going wrong. Like the normal errors that you see throughout the country was what we saw, rather than these big sort of blow ups that I was kind of dreading we might see. So good news for democracy. It was a very boring election and for the most part was accepted. A few other good things for democracy I just want to highlight. So we talk about election deniers, and I'm going to use that term. I'm specifically here focusing on the Secretary of State races. So in most states, the Secretary of State is in charge of elections. Now, there are a number of exceptions. Here in Utah, for instance, it's the lieutenant governor that's in charge of elections. That's also true in Alaska, actually. And then a number of states also have election boards who are in charge of elections. So it's not always the Secretary of State, but in quite a number of states, the Secretary of State is the chief election official. And that role has gotten more and more politicized in recent years. It's seen as a stepping stone in a lot of ways. And this has actually been true for a long time, of a lot of people who run for Secretary of State because they eventually want to be governor, for instance. And as such has become more partisan and more polarized in recent years. So it is typically a partisan position. It's a Democrat or a Republican running for it. And this year we saw quite a number of people running for Secretary of State who denied the results of the election in 2020. And this takes a lot of different flavors. Part of it is saying, oh, there were irregularities, and so that result wasn't valid for whatever reason. Or they just kind of take the tack that we need to make voting a little bit, they want to kind of secure the process a little bit more is the way that they phrase it. But the things that I use here are based on media reporting nationally. I sourced NPR, Politico, PBS NewsHour for a few of these. But just nationally, there were quite a few election deniers that lost their Republican primaries. And I will note, it's tough here because I like to be nonpartisan in this role, but it is Republicans. Every single candidate who ran as an election denier or who made those types of comments was a Republican this year. So there were a number that lost their Republican primaries. And so there was an extremist running, somebody who was denying the results of the election, running against typically a more moderate Republican. And in those states, the more moderate Republican rather than the election denier came out of the primary. So that was true in Arkansas, Colorado, Georgia, Idaho, and Ohio. And then subsequently in the general election, there were a number of candidates running for Secretary of State who were very adamant that the election was not fair. Particularly in a few battleground states where they were pretty close elections. But in each of those, they lost. In Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Nevada, the election denying Secretary of State candidate lost. So again, this is all good news for democracy. The secretaries or the candidates that won in those cases will uphold the process and believe that election administration in this country is well run, which is, I think, generally what those of us that look at it closely, we all think that too. Georgia in particular was interesting because the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, was reelected. And you may remember him from that infamous phone call with former President Trump, where he was asked to find additional votes. So that was an important one. He was reelected. Pennsylvania was also important. In Pennsylvania, the Secretary of State position is appointed by the governor. So the governor, there was an election denying gubernatorial candidate who also lost in Pennsylvania. So the governor is someone who will uphold election laws and he will be selecting the Secretary of State. So that was an important one as well. That was also a battleground state. This is a little bit hard to see, but this was an NPR graphic that I found really interesting. So it indicated that election denying Secretary of State candidates actually underperformed other Republicans on a statewide level. So this is, again, encouraging for democracy because it's showing that even compared to fellow Republicans, those that were denying the election did not do that well. So just kind of a positive thing for democracy. And then there are a few states that were just less competitive overall, like Iowa and Idaho, for example, where the Secretary of State candidate did accept election results and upheld the election administration process, and they actually ended up being the top vote getter in the state. So overall, those that are supporting the process did better than those who denied it. But there is a bit of bad news too. So this is a map of actually state legislative control. Well, it's state control. So it's the two houses and also the governor's seat. So the states that are in red, they have both houses of the state legislature and also the governor's seat. The ones that are in, the Republicans have that are in red, the Democrats have it that are in blue, and the ones that are in yellow are split in various ways. So it could be that the two houses of the legislature are split, or it could be that the two houses are one party and the governor is a different party. But the reason that this is important is because it's legislatures where election laws in this country are actually made. Every state has slightly different election laws. And in some of the ones that are completely controlled by Republicans, you have a fair number of election deniers among those ranks, whether they're incumbents or newly elected. And so it remains to be seen sort of the changes that we might see, particularly in these states that are dominated by the Republican Party, because there is a portion of the Republican Party that believes that the election was not fair and that they need to tighten up election laws in one way or another. Interestingly, though, the Democrats actually held every state house that they had previously and even flipped a few chambers. So it was a decent election in terms of legislatures for the Democrats. And again, I think it was a reaction in some ways to this denial of the election on a national level. We also have to be a little bit worried. There were probably, by most counts, over 100 Congress people who were elected this election who have denied the election results. And that's worrisome. Again, most things are done on the state level. Most election laws happen on the state level, but there are some things that are national that could come up. For instance, if a presidential election was sent to the House of Representatives for whatever reason, that could become an issue. Or if they do decide to make any changes to the Electoral College, that could become an issue on the national level as well. So why does any of this matter? Why are we concerned about these individuals that are denying the election, either as legislators or secretaries of state? A few different things that they've said, and this comes directly from those candidates on the campaign trail, is that they would seek to limit early voting and vote by mail opportunities. There's even someone who won a county clerk position here in Utah who has indicated that he might take away some of those vote by mail opportunities. There are quite a few that have said they're just going to get rid of ballot drop boxes. That's more nationally, but ballot drop boxes have become more and more popular. And actually a lot of our ballots here in Utah end up going into the drop boxes. And so in states where there's been pushback against that, that really is going to reduce turnout and really going to affect a lot of people that prefer to vote that way. There's also a lot of rhetoric about going back to hand counting paper ballots. And this is particularly important. Like Eve said, when you're only looking at 2,000 ballots with the write-ins, that took a really long time. Now imagine if you had to look at every single ballot, even in Summit County, which is relatively small, and Eve would probably know the numbers, but I think we maybe had 20,000 or probably less than 20,000 votes countywide. Can you imagine looking at every single one of those by hand and how long that would take? And just the fact that humans are error prone anyway, and even like I've worked with Eve, I've done the counting center sometimes, and all you have to do is count 50 ballots at a time because you're putting them in batches. And I can't tell you how many times you don't get to 50 and you're like, oh no, there were only 49. But the next time you count it, oh, there were 50. Oh wait, were there really 49? So imagining going back to hand counting paper ballots rather than the machines that we use now that do it very, very quickly. Just the amount of chaos that could cause, just in terms of how much time it's going to take, how many people you'd have to hire to do that, how error prone it could be. There's just a lot of ways that it's not a good idea. And this is what some of these legislators and Secretary of State candidates who are denying the election are pushing to go back to that, to take away the machines entirely. Another one that has come up, in particular, the Secretary of State that was recently elected in Alabama wants to take the state out of ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center. And what ERIC does is help with voter list maintenance. So it's a consortium of states, and they actually compare their voter list information. So you're trying to identify people who have moved to a different state, for example. And so it's good because it actually cleans the voter lists of states that are involved, and it benefits everybody. It's always better if we know where voters actually live. In particular, for a vote by mail state like Utah, it's very important. And we are a member of ERIC. Alabama was. And the recently elected Secretary of State has said that he's going to take them out of that organization. And that's purely political. There's some rhetoric out there about the funding of ERIC that some people don't agree with, but it's a security measure. So it actually undermines the security of the elections, ironically. So those are a few of the things that legislators and secretaries of state are possibly looking at doing or might do in the coming years if they have the power, which they do in a lot of states. We also have seen an increase. So I didn't really talk about county clerk candidates or those that run elections on the county level across the country, because frankly, nobody exactly tracked this. It's really tough. There are thousands of people that run elections on the local and county level throughout the country. And so it's really hard to know how many of those harbor some of those feelings that the election was not fair and want to go into this to undermine the process, but there definitely are some. And so we have seen there was a famous case in Colorado, actually, where there was basically an insider attack is what we call it. So there was someone who was a county clerk who allowed others into the space where the voting machines were and were able to access proprietary information. So you have, if you've got county clerks who are in charge of elections in various places who don't believe the election was fair or who are providing access to malicious actors, that's a really tough thing to guard against, because they're the ones that are supposed to be protecting this process. And if they're the ones that are being that are actually attacking the process, there's unfortunately not much you can do. So that's the other concern about this election denial movement, and that some of these county clerk positions may be taken over by someone who believes that. I mentioned a little bit the politicization of election administration. So this is a concern both at the state level, but also at the county level, where this used to be like a very clerical, very like bureaucratic, like, you know, you kind of put your head down and you ran an election. And now it's a lot more in the popular imagination. I always say that, like, when I started this 10 years ago, or even before 2016, you'd tell someone that you were in election administration, they'd have no idea what that meant. And now everybody knows this, and everybody has opinions about audits and about vote by mail and drop boxes and all these really things that at one time not many people were interested in, and now everybody's got an opinion about it. The biggest thing that I worry about with that is the possibility that we're losing people. And we absolutely are losing people. I think in Utah, we had about 20% turnover of county clerks. And that's true really nationwide, is you have people who have done this for a long time. Maybe they were close to retirement and just said, hey, I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's been a rough few years. You know, we had foreign interference, then we had cybersecurity issues, then we had COVID, and now we have people who are threatening election officials for doing their job. So my biggest worry about all of this is that we're losing good people, and there's no real easy way to backfill. And it takes quite a while to kind of get your feet under you. Elections is complicated, and it's very much in the public eye. And so you can't just kind of learn this stuff at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
So that's one of my biggest worries still going forward. It was a worry going into this, but again, it went pretty well this time. But this was a midterm. And when we're looking at those turnout numbers, 2024 is going to be there's a lot more scrutiny. There's a presidential election, and there's going to be a lot higher turnout. So it's one of those things that is going to be an issue over the next couple of years, and just something to keep an eye on. And just the overall creation of doubt about the integrity of our elections is a big concern. It sounds dire, but this is actually what happens in authoritarian regimes, is you start to doubt the actual process, and then you stop participating, and then it allows those that want to suppress votes, that would rather be less democratic, gives them some wiggle room. So overall, I maybe should have started with the good news. I ended with the bad news, but overall, this election, it was well run. We didn't see major glitches. We didn't see any violence, which is crazy to say in this country, but there was some worries that we'd see some political violence. And most of the election deniers did not win their seats. Oh, I just realized I didn't highlight, there were a couple that did. So in addition to sort of these legislatures that are concerning, the person who has denied the integrity of elections won in Wyoming. He is the Wyoming Secretary of State now. He was actually unchallenged in the general election. He won his primary and was unchallenged in the general. Has already told the county clerks that he's going to make some big changes there. I mentioned Alabama and the secretary wanting to take the state out of ERIC. So the election denying candidate also won in Alabama. So there are a few places where it's worrisome. Indiana is the other one. There was an election denying Secretary of State who won in Indiana. So overall, we upheld democracy. It didn't resonate with people to vote for candidates that denied the election. But there are still some pockets that are concerning. And again, it is still something to keep an eye on in advance of 2024. So I will unshare my screen if there are any questions.
Katy, if you were to say what states we should be watching, I guess with a little apprehension, what states would those be?
I'm worried about Texas. I'm always worried about Texas. Wyoming worries me because it's our neighbor and because they've adopted a lot of similar policies to us. And I'm worried about backsliding. I'm worried about what's going to happen over there. The longtime election director was fired right after the primary. Even the Secretary of State basically said, look, I won the primary. I'm not even going to win my general. I'm in here. You're out. So I always, after a big election like this, I'm like looking all over the country to see who I know that lost their job. And there's a lot of them. Yeah, so Wyoming, Texas, possibly Indiana. But overall, again, I don't want to be too dire about it. Like it was mostly positive. I would also say, particularly in advance of 2024, Eve mentioned that there were some poll watchers this time, and there were more poll watchers, I think, in the primary. As the League of Women Voters, I think that's something that we really need to focus on in the next couple of years and really get a fair number of people to observe the election in 2024. To support the clerks more than anything, honestly. I mean, part of it is to look and make sure that nothing is going wrong, but it's also to support the clerks and say, look, this was a fair process, and explain something like results were a little bit late, for example, but there was a very good reason for it. There wasn't anything going on that was out of the ordinary. So I think, especially in advance of the presidential election, that the league should really focus on that observing and poll watching aspect.
Okay. Terry Goodall has a question. Why don't you say your question? It's in the chat. Terry, are you there?
Yeah, Katie. So the Freedom to Vote Act is up during the lame duck session now. And do you think it would have any impact on election administration?
You know, I haven't looked at it recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it recently because I know they've been making some edits, but they were at one point pushing some pretty significant changes to election administration. It's hard because in general, I actually support state-based election administration, except during scary times like this, when there's a lot of people taking over positions where they could change it significantly. So I am in general in favor of, so federal legislation has typically not been used for elections. There are a few notable exceptions: the Voting Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act after the 2000 election. Usually we don't see national voting legislation, which is why that's been really controversial. But I think with what we've seen, particularly since 2013 with the Shelby decision, where they took away a lot of the protections from the Voting Rights Act, we need a floor of, so a standard floor of what you can expect from voting and election administration in the country. So for example, there are a number of states that still don't offer early voting. Everybody should offer early voting. Now we can debate how much early voting is appropriate. And frankly, in Utah, we don't need that much early voting because we have so much vote by mail. So that's where a state by state sort of situation, you need to look at each state and what their individual situation is and how their voters like to vote. But there should be a floor that just everybody offers it. No excuse absentee voting is the other. There are still a number of states that you have to have an excuse to be able to request an absentee ballot. Why? Another one is possibly registration requirements. In Utah, we have same day registration, which is great. So if somebody didn't become aware of the election until election day, which happens sometimes, they can still go and register and vote and have that vote counted. And that would be another one where I would support having it across states.
Katie, I'm embarrassed to say this, but the Freedom to Vote Act, what's the status of that?
Well, and I don't know that I know. So Terry said,
It's
actually up in the lame duck?
Yeah.
No.
It's been, I don't know that it's been brought to the Senate floor. There was a roll call vote on it, and they're expecting to bring it to the Senate. Whether it will make it through the Senate and the House in the limited time they have before January 3rd is questionable, but they're trying to get it through.
Okay, good. Thank you. And note that Terry in the chat is thanking Chris Best for being an observer in the Wasatch clerk's office. Okay, more questions. Martha.
I was just wondering if Katie had any observations, on it just came to light today that there's a county in Arizona a rural county in Arizona not certifying their results. The deadline was yesterday, and I'm curious as to what happens? What's the process when that, what do you do?
I don't know. It's a good question. So that's another worry with sort of the positions that a lot of people are in. So typically, the certification of results is really a very administrative process. It happened with our county last week, and at that point, it's just basically a presentation of here's everything, here you go. Usually, people just kind of sign off on it. That's that. So this, it's kind of a new trend, if you will, because it did happen in 2020 as well, of an identification of the fact that there are people there's usually Canvas boards, certification boards. They're often bipartisan. And so these people could have this power to not certify. But that's a relatively new phenomenon. So I don't actually know what the recourse is. And then it also typically goes to, so there's two levels of it. So it happens on a county level where you're certifying your results on the county level, and then it goes up to the state as well. And so the state, whether it's the Secretary of the State or it's a state canvassing board, certifies the results statewide. And that usually doesn't even happen until the middle of December or so. So people don't always realize that elections aren't official until all of that has occurred, which is actually quite a few weeks after the election. It hasn't typically happened. Again, it's usually very administrative. It's just, yes, stamp, great, it's done. So I don't know what the recourse is for those that are refusing to certify, to be honest. Yeah.
Just
Eve,
to add on, I was looking into it a little bit, and just from news reports, so who knows exactly, but from what I can see, there's an attempt to force the certification through the courts. But what the state has said is if the county doesn't certify the results, then that county's votes will not be counted in the votes for their state. And it's kind of interesting because it's a very Republican county. And the main reason that they are not certifying is because of concerns about what happened in a different county, in Maricopa County, that they view as more progressive, more liberal. And what would happen, in fact, is I guess two of the races would actually flip from being for Republican candidates to being for Democrats if they don't certify their results. So they're cutting off their noses to spite their faces. So I kind of feel like at some point somebody's going to go, let's just certify this and we'll just register our objections. But I'm kind of surprised that hasn't happened already.
Wow, that's interesting. Katie, this election denier or the challenging or not certifying, that trend, do you see that continuing? Or is it gonna go away?
Well, like I said, I think it's encouraging that we didn't see as much of it as I would have anticipated. And a lot of the candidates that lost so far have, for the most part, kind of accepted that they lost. So that was another thing that I was worried about, is that we'd see a lot of just unfounded challenges of results because of a candidate that lost. And we haven't seen much of that yet. So I think that that's encouraging. But I also think that there are people who have become aware of all of this stuff that, again, used to be just very administrative and just something that happened, and that they may try to use that in the future. Yeah. Yeah. And again, going into, I know it's, well, I keep thinking, oh, this one's just over. Why am I already thinking about the next one? But I am. And so already thinking about 2024. And again, what happened this time was encouraging, because in some ways, like a lot of the people in the field thought this was going to be a test case for what they could do in 2024. And we haven't seen a lot of that. So it's encouraging, but I don't think it's going away either.
Okay. Kathy Beely, you just put something in the chat that can you just say what it is and let people note to
Sorry,
look
I'm multitasking here, Jill.
at. Of
Yeah,
course.
It's actually a good synopsis of the Freedom to Vote Act from the Campaign Legal Center, with whom we've been working on our redistricting lawsuit. So if you want to know more, I would click on that link.
Thank you. Very good. Okay, more questions? I wanted to, Eve, you mentioned that there was one county that the new county clerk wants to get rid of in-person voting across the board. That is Utah County, right?
Or not in-person voting. He does not find mail-in voting safe.
Mail-in.
And if it was his choice, he would do away with it. He does recognize that it's required by the legislature. And so what he's stated, his focus will be his first focus will be on cleaning up the voter roll, because he does not think that it is sufficiently narrow based on sort of anecdotal evidence of people getting more ballots at their address than for the people that live there. So that's going to be his first focus, is on the voter roll. And so I think that's definitely something that people should be keeping their eyes on. You know, Phil Lyman last year, who ran a bill trying to do away with many aspects of mail-in voting, got reelected. I anticipate we'll see a redo on that front. And now that the county clerk in Utah County is very suspect of mail-in voting, he's also pledged to be very open with respect to providing information about the election process with the public and allowing audits, multiple audits. He thinks that elections ought to be audited as much as possible. And also having precinct audits, he calls them, which would be by, and have people who don't work for the county doing those audits. So I think there might be it might look different this session, what comes up, but I imagine we'll see some efforts on those around audits, both audits and voter rolls this front as well.
So you're saying that it is law that we as a state have universal mail-in ballots. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And so that would have to change for that to go away.
Eve, one of the things they did last year was that legislative audit, partly to kind of ease some of those fears. Do you know what the status is?
Yes, they are supposed to be giving their results. It's like, I forget exactly when, but I think it's in that second week in December that the legislative auditor is going to give the results of that audit. So we'll see. And I would note the audit, as part of bills that were passed last year, the audit that we do of the election did change this year to include an audit of the voter registration, as well as being of the signatures and of the ballots themselves. So that is a new thing that we did this year. And that will be continuing, is our expectation, because that's part of law now.
Good. We have a second for, well, not much time. I think that we'll probably ought to close this here and turn it over to Chris Cherniak. Eve, thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. We really got into this. It's amazing. I'm going to have a lot of detailed notes to try to take here. Chris is the host of This Green Earth radio show on KPCW, and he is on the Summit County Health Board. Give us your update on our two topics.
Our quick update on both the drought and viruses, in plural now, since we have COVID, we have seasonal flu, and we have RSV. So I'll get to that second. First, the drought. I'll put quotes around it because we don't typically think of drought in the middle in the winter when there's lots of frozen water on the ground. But we as a state continue to be in drought conditions, although it's improved much. 1 year ago at this time, roughly 80% of the state was either experiencing extreme or exceptional drought. Those are the two worst drought conditions. And now only 50% of the state is experiencing those two levels of drought. So we're seeing some improvement precipitation, and that is as of November 23rd. And so it doesn't include this storm that we just had. The northern part of the state is experiencing improvement more so than the southern part of the state. And specifically in Summit County, our drought level is down to severe, which is actually good, relatively speaking. We're only severe drought. We've improved, but Wasatch County continues to be in what's considered an extreme drought condition, which is a bit worse. But overall, again, this storm we had last night and the storms we're expecting in the next few days are going to go a long ways to improving conditions, and that hopefully will be reflected in next month's report. So that's the drought conditions. Turning to viruses, I'll start with seasonal flu because that's here every year. We have flu season. It's here. It's there's no big surprises with respect to it. Get your flu shot to address it. COVID also still around, right? I have a friend of mine who just tested positive. So it's still present. You can get, the latest booster is designed to address the original virus, we'll call it, and the most recent variant, the Omega variants or so. I got mine at the Department of Health a few weeks ago. And for the first time, I had some pretty robust side effects, a 1 day worth of fever or so. But the booster shots are still available. Get those. Finally, RSV. That's an interesting virus. But it's really common. And in fact, everyone on this screen, I feel confident saying, has had a case of RSV at some point in their lives or multiple times. We get it starting when we're babies and going through. Over time, we develop a measure of immunity to it because we've had it several times. What you're reading in the paper, in the news, is that it's affecting children much more so, and there are more children showing up in hospitals with RSV. And the thought is that because we did such a good job back in 2020 and 2021 with masks and distancing, the RSV cases in those children were much less. And now that we've kind of returned to quote unquote normal situations, those RSV cases are kind of catching up. And so more and more kids are simply getting this RSV for the first time. And again, these are babies, newborns, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds who may be getting RSV for the first time. And because the numbers are so much bigger, the numbers showing up at the hospital are also bigger. RSV is contagious, and it's passed through droplets like any virus, but also on surfaces. It tends to last long than normal on surfaces. That's why daycares and nursery schools and stuff have to be extra vigilant in controlling, keeping a clean environment with respect to RSV. And again, all viruses. So that's kind of the update. The Summit County Health Department has additional information. You can go there to their website and learn more about all these viruses amongst us. And that is your update, drought and virus update. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Joan Entwistle, just if you look, Eve, if you look in the chat, she is praising you for the good elections. And Terry Goodall just put a link to Gerke's commentary piece on water. So you can check those out. But I think it is exactly 12 o'clock. Thank you all for being here. We won't have a meeting in December, but in January, the last Tuesday of the month, we'll be back on it. Thank you all for being here.